Welcome to the new episode of the Marketing Meeting. My guest today is Douglas Davis. He's an Emmy Award-winning strategist, the principal of the Davis Group LLC, the former chair of the Communication Design Department at New York City College of Technology. But I get to know him through his best-selling book, Creative Strategy and Business of Design. This was a really big highlight book for me back in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. I wish I could hold the book in my hand because it's very well written.
Thank you.
I just left it in my nice bookshelf back at home with all my other beloved books. It's a very nice book, very well written. It has a sleek design on top of that, so it was completely a joy to read. Enough of the introduction. So, hello, Douglas, and thank you so much for joining me for the podcast.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me. I very much appreciate it.
So, you started as a designer first, then you got involved in strategy and integrated marketing on the path.
Yeah,
Um, can you tell a bit about your story? How did that happen?
I can. And I'll actually go way back in order to make sure that our listeners can hopefully relate to something that is in my origin story. Um,
Mhm.
I'll start in high school, for instance. Um, I went, I'm from Lexington, South Carolina. That's where I was born. And I remember that my guidance counselor in high school, excuse me, I didn't have one conversation. I'm so sorry. I don't know why this is happening as soon as we're recording.
That's all right.
Me. I'll start again if that's okay. Um,
Yeah, yeah, sure. I'll just cut
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
part. Don't worry.
So there are two parts to that story. And I'll start out by saying that my guidance counselor in high school and I didn't have one conversation about college in 4 years. So, just to give you a bit of a background, I started my career in a time that pretty much mirrors the current disruption right now. In 1999, I .com sort of found my website and they hired me as a digital designer. About 1 year into my 2 year program at Pratt, I was getting my master's here at Pratt Institute. And while I entered the job market in a more traditional pathway, when you really think about it, web design programs they didn't exist. And very
Mhm.
few of my professors had experience in this new digital space back then. So back then, if you rewind back in your head, when somebody said that they were a designer, you understood like 99.9% that you're basically discussing print, right? And
Hmm.
designers they could choose to learn the web, but a lot of people didn't choose that. And that was in no way seen as a risk. And as you know, in January 2000, the dot-com bust happened, right? So in 18 months, when the economy came back, the environmental shift was really reflected in the question, which are you? Are you a web designer or are you a print designer? And that experience
Ah.
taught me two things. The first thing that taught me was that my willingness to learn something new is what got me the job, not my credentials. And I think the second thing that taught me was that Pratt didn't prepare me to get a job. It did prepare me to survive as a freelancer for about 18 months when there were no jobs. So that blur of transitions between education, entering the workforce, recession, entrepreneurship, all of those things helped shape my perspective on the business of creativity. So that's the first
Mhm.
part. I became the professor of design with no plans to go to college. So that's why I started out by saying that my guidance counselor in high school never had even one conversation with me about um, graphic design or career options. Um, the second part of this story, in terms of my own origin story, um, as I mentioned in 1999, if you think about that disruption, I started my career then at a time that pretty much mirrors this current disruption because of the pandemic. Um, and I think, when you think about that, web design programs didn't exist back then. And I think, you know, you get into a situation where you move forward and you get promoted for doing your job really well. You can build the
Mm,
team, you can write the proposal, you can pitch the business, but you may not know how to justify your creative recommendations within the context of business and marketing objectives. So, oftentimes at that point in my career, even though I was right, I was the youngest person in the room. I didn't know how to justify uh, those recommendations that again were right as a designer from a design standpoint who happen to be leading business or business accounts or driving business on the digital side. So I lost those battles with my marketing or business counterparts because I didn't know how to speak or understand the language of business. And one day I
mm,
stumbled into a strategy session and I realized, oh, hey, this is that thing that keeps beating me. This is that thing that I don't even know what it is. It's that thing at this point in my career. But I understood something about the fact that this was the why behind what we were trained to do. And if we're all honest, as creative people, many of us were taught to focus on the tactical parts of what should be larger strategic decisions without even understanding that we were in the room. We're in the room to solve a business problem with design or with creativity. And so it
mhm,
was really my failure, I think, to understand exactly what was being asked of me that wasn't in the room to make it pretty. I wasn't there to make it hot, wasn't there to make it pop, even though oftentimes we're trained in a situation where that's exactly what we're being asked. That's what we're being
mm,
told to do. And so, in understanding that I didn't have the full perspective, and in understanding that the people who were on my team didn't have the vocabulary to understand how to speak to me in a way that would inspire me to get the best out of me to bring that creativity to the business problem, I sought to learn that language myself because I knew that they weren't going to learn it. So that's really how I stumbled into the profession. I didn't even know what graphic design was. Um, but it's also how I then evolved from just being a designer or someone who would take an order, essentially,
yeah.
and move towards the why behind what things look like. I'll give you one last piece of this story. What was really interesting is that at that fork in the road, I had the choice, like many other designers. I could double down on the execution part of things, right? That's what we were taught. So at that time, the choice was learn Flash, learn Action Script, right? And I realized that I wanted to inject creativity into the beginning of solving the business problem. So again, like Tipper Coleman said, that we're here to inject art into commerce. And so I wanted to learn commerce. I knew that I needed to understand the why we were at the table first. And I wanted to
Yeah.
go upstream, essentially. So I'm so thankful that I decided to learn strategy, to learn the language that was being spoken in the room, business, marketing,
Mhm.
because had I decided to sort of become even more of a practitioner, and in this particular case, had I decided to become a specialist in
Mm,
Flash and Action Script, like many of my peers were doing, that was very lucrative back in the day. Um, I'd be in a bad situation right now because, surprise, that technology is gone. And I
yeah.
think it's just really important to understand that we should be multiplying our options. That's a really important thing. It's about options and not necessarily about plans because plans can shift. Your decision to do
Yeah.
something could, you know, again, it may take 20 years, which in this case took 20 years for Flash to sort of arrive on the scene, become the hot thing, and then die. But it's
Yeah.
really important for us, I think, as creative people to understand that it's about leadership and it's about business, and we are
Mhm.
there to answer a business problem with creativity that's on brand, on strategy, and on message. So that's me.
Mhm.
That's how I got here.
Welcome
Thank
again.
you.
I mean, I think you are the best person to answer two important questions because On the creative side, when you talk to the creative people, they would give a perspective and they would help us empathize with the creative industry and what do they need from us. Because as creatives, they need inputs and feedback, and they need to work
Right.
with business people. And on the business side, you have to know how to work with a creative, how their thinking and how their framework is working. And in that sense, they also need to understand and empathize with the creative world, so that it's like a better collaboration, and the best work comes out of that, right? I mean, if both business people and creative people understand each other and then come
Yes.
up with a nice solution. I think in that sense, you are the perfect person to ask that
You're
question.
very kind.
My first question is that uh, the designers need to understand, as you said, more than design in order to stand out in their field. So, what are some of the common business concepts that a designer need to understand, first of all?
Well, you're very kind. I really appreciate that. Chapter one in creative strategy and the business of design really deals with this in detail. So, if you are listening and you're interested, that chapter one is where this question would be answered in great detail. But I'd say um, this is all very relative because if you understand um, where we as creative people in some points in my perspective where we misunderstand why we're in the room, it's because we're unclear of the purpose of why we're in the room, right? Again, and
Mhm.
just sort of looking back to how we were trained, um, design school doesn't teach business, roughly. And what you're really concerned about is the details, the tactical parts, as I mentioned, of what should be larger strategic decisions without even understanding what those things are. So we're focused on the tangible aspects of a brand, right? Typefaces, Pantone colors. We're focused on graphic elements. We may be focused on just the visual language part of things. And I think this is where, in my opinion, design and business education sets us up to fail because when you think about and this is the context because it's really important to understand the context before I get to the specific part of your question. Um, the way we were taught in that creative process, define the problem in your own words and sort of move forward in a series of questions that we then try to solve to come up with the execution or the answer. Um, if our clients are not in some ways, if we don't understand how to translate what the client requests are, it sort of shows you where this problem is of being trained in silos, where the client will ask you for they'll ask you for design, but they need strategy. But we weren't taught
Mhm, mhm.
strategy in design school. So our marketing and business counterparts, or even the client themselves, they expect everyone involved with their business to be strategic. And so there's this catch 22 where you're on the same team to solve this client problem, and the education that trained you to become professionals to be on the same team didn't teach you to talk to each other. And so if business school doesn't teach how to inspire designers, what you get is you get oftentimes, and many of your listeners may be familiar with this, you get a brief that's the size of a novel with completely irrelevant information. And what does that do? That makes you focus back on your strengths, which is your aesthetic vocabulary, in a work dynamic that's asking for you to solve a business problem, right? So it perpetuates the issue that we were trained in silos when we get on a team of silos and everyone's expectations or even viewpoint of what the problem is and what they were there to do is essentially a completely different perspective. So my philosophy becomes think how they think to do what we do. And now let me get to the specifics. Think how they think, right? And this is why this is relative to your situation as a designer. You may be in a design firm, you may be in an advertising agency, you may be in a digital shop, you might be at a mobile creative shop. They, in your situation, is relative, and you have to figure out what and how to define they, right? But it's important to think how they think. My job is to help creative people approach their roles as a strategist. That's my job, right?
Mm.
That's what I want to do. So it all depends on where you're at and what the culture is in your current situation. So the business concepts that you should understand are relative to your situation. If you're in an advertising agency, you're being asked to solve a problem with a writer because you all are a team, then it's really important to understand not just what your role is as a creative person, but it's really important for you to understand what the person above you is going to be judged on. Because if we can step into their shoes, again, think how they think. They, in this particular instance, might be your creative director, it might be your account director, it may be the ECD, whoever's controlling things in your current culture. It's important for you to understand how to step into their shoes and define how they will be judged in terms of success or an end of the
Mhm.
year review. Because if you do that, it'll tell you what business concepts you should be familiar with. If your job is concerned with moving the needle on a certain metric, driving traffic, increasing sales, decreasing unsubscribes, increasing downloads, um, increasing awareness, launching something, right? Those are the specific business and marketing concepts that you need to understand so that you can weave strategy into the creative process. And I always tell creatives at all levels who are sort of coming to this and wanting to become more comfortable at that table where there's a different conversation going on than the one that's in the creative team, that it's really important for you to understand that strategy is a set of choices, just like design is a set of choices, right? And it's
Yeah.
iterative, right? So you go through a set of choices, you play that set out, and you arrive somewhere, and you can
Mhm.
determine whether that is or isn't working when you start to weave strategy into the creative process, when you can defend the work without being defensive. And I think it's very important for some of the tools that you'll see in chapter one. One of those business concepts is one that I created, which is called the Creative Strategy Framework. And it's
Yeah.
there for creatives who are in this situation where they want to become more confident at the table. They want to understand strategy. They want to weave strategy into the creative process to organize the chaos so that
Mhm.
you can question the answers, which means, hey, this worked 6 months ago, but hey, there was a pandemic. This worked 2 years ago, but hey, there was a new entrant that sort of entered the industry, or there was a recession, or whatever could happen, right, in the sort of range of your career. Um,
Yeah.
to then question whether what used to work still works. Does it still apply? Did the environment shift in a way that we need to look at this problem completely differently? So after you organize the
Yeah.
chaos, you can question the answers in order to then
Mhm.
extract insights and then turn those insights into execution. So those three steps are the things that you will get from the book overall, but that one particular concept that I'd like to focus on has to do with the creative strategy framework and the broader understanding, in my opinion, of where you're at and what's required of you is the start of figuring out the answer to, well, hey, what business concept should creatives be interested in? That is a relative thing. And I can't tell you. That's something that
Yeah.
you have to understand and approach with discernment. But my job is to help creatives get ready for the transitions. The
Yeah.
transitions are really important.
Yeah, yeah, and also like you're talking on the creative side because I mean like it's like taking control of what you do,
Yes.
right? I mean, as a designer and creative, if the business person is doesn't know how to brief you properly and what's the problem that they want the creative to solve, then the creative should be the person who should take control of the situation and
100%.
ask the right question to the business person, because
100%.
business person, or the category manager, or the brand manager should probably come up with, okay, what do you want, the creative would ask probably, and then they would probably come up with an answer of, okay, we would like to drive traffic to the site, or even worse than that, we would like to increase sales. Okay, which is like, okay, which is not a brief that you should be giving to the creative, because it's a very big concept, right? Increasing sales is like a concept that involves even the CEO together,
Right.
not only the creative. So that's why, in that sense, I think the creative person needs to have the right questions to ask in order to diagnose the problem that the business person is trying to solve. So it's like, so that the creative is taking control of the situation in order to deliver better work. But on the other side, on the business side, I believe that business people also need to understand how to brief and how to translate those things. So I think it's both. This is a really good discussion for both the creative side, but also from the business side, because they are the people actually who needs to know how to brief a creative.
100%. And I would just add two things. First thing is that creative people need to understand what our worth is and exactly how important we are to
Mhm.
this overall process, right? Um, so I always like to say that, creatives are the spoonful of sugar that, um, make business and marketing objectives palatable to the public. Your
Yeah.
marketing or your client or your business counterpart, they can't go public without what we do. So it's really important for designers to understand that part of it. I think the second
Yeah.
part is equally important, and you sort of alluded at it. Um, Marketers or business people have a very important role in this process, right? Um, we've all attended briefings, and we've we get a lot of information, we get irrelevant information, um, but we I've never left a brief with all the information, right? So there's some part of the picture that you're going to get from the marketer or from the new business person or from the client themselves, but the designer, the creative person, the art director, the whoever you are, the creative person needs to understand the business and marketing objectives, because as you mentioned, um, these are larger concepts that involve more people outside the creative group. And yet, if we
Hmm.
don't understand what these concepts are, we can't ask the right questions of the people in the process who should know these things to give us what we need to do
Hmm.
our job. So again, think about it. You get a novel that's the size of a book because your account director or because your client doesn't understand how to inspire creatives. So what do? They think they're helping you by putting in everything in the kitchen sink without discerning what exactly should be in that brief. And I
Hmm.
mentioned in the book as well, I invited some of my friends who are on the business side. There are more strategists, who are more writers, so that we can hear from them exactly what the benefits are of understanding how to work with creatives. That's a really important part of the book as well. But specifically, they're not going to learn what we do. They're not going to learn Pantone
Hmm.
colors. They're not going to learn specifics about typography. They don't want to hear the ins and outs of, well, I was walking in the Mojave Desert and the way that the sun was shining, it's shown on this, really nice iridescent lizard that was, showing all these really interesting colors. And because of that color palette, I then thought about, like, they don't want to go on that journey. The creative people do. They're like, they're with you. They're with you in the
Hmm.
desert. Like they're with you and they want to be with you. They want to hear that story. Business people want to hear the destination first. What is your recommendation? And why, right? Then we
Hmm.
might
Hmm.
get into the what like later down the line, but specifically right now, I want to understand what you're asking me to do and why you've asked that. So creative people must be concerned with things outside the creative team, because if we're not only do we not know how to deal with those situations where someone doesn't know how to brief you or someone doesn't know how to inspire you, or they're a part of the process and they're interjecting things that are actually detrimental to the creative process, right? It's our job to understand how to protect the creative product, but also to look at the environment that creativity exists in so that we can
Hmm.
understand what the other people are concerned with so we can translate their requests. So that it's not just
Hmm.
that, hey, we need a new identity, and we say, great, we can do a cool identity. We can hear that request as, hey, I need a new identity, but we can immediately start thinking as creative people why they asked for that. What are the
Yeah.
business objectives? What are the marketing, issues that we need to answer so that we can understand how to deliver options on a marketing, a new identity that includes ways to actually address the business problem in there so that someone's not forcing it in there after you've made the creative decisions, and you're not defensive protecting those creative decisions. I've been there where you're like, they're stupid, they don't understand, they're messing up everything. How could they not know that this works as it is? Why are they asking me to put X, Y, and Z, or to change this, and that? They're asking that because they didn't ask for it in the brief. You didn't understand that it wasn't there. You went through the process, and now what we're doing is we're pigeonholing things. We're forcing
Yeah,
things.
blaming
Now
each
we're
other.
blaming, and like, it doesn't matter who lost the account, right? We lost the account.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for us to really, as creative people, approach our roles as a strategist to really understand these concepts so that we can ask for what we need when what we're
Hmm.
given falls short.
Hmm. Could you tell us a bit about that creative strategic
Yeah,
framework, especially the introduction part of
yeah.
it?
Well, it's a three-step, four-column framework that I invented in NYU when I was in business school. So again, rewind back to that story. Oh, I stumbled into the strategy session. I realized that if I become the designer or the creative person who understands business, I can increase the trust in the room as I decrease the fear when I'm asking for my marketing or business or client to take creative leaps with me by speaking the same language,
Hmm.
right? Speaking and understanding the language of business. So at NYU, I realized that one of the biggest problems for me as a creative person who is now understanding business was information overload. Like, you get all this
Hmm.
information, it's not necessarily in any particular order that makes sense to you. It's coming at you maybe 60% of the time in a format that's probably just a template, right? Oftentimes these briefs are not necessarily something that's custom crafted. They are something that they have, like, fill in the blank. When's the deadline? What are you asking for? Who's the client? Who's the target? And maybe even sometimes it doesn't have essential information like who the target is. I have been in situations where I've been asked to create campaigns, and the most important piece of information is not even there. So you're
Hmm.
being asked,
You mean by the target, the
like, who we're talking to.
who are,
Yeah,
yeah,
who we
the
should, right,
consumer, the
right. Who
customer.
who are we trying to reach? So you're basically being given this assignment in something that's more of a template, that's like a formality in order to kick off a job that is being looked at as basically a project and not necessarily within the overall context of how the brand is speaking to people and how it's presenting itself in its external communications, and how it needs to be consistent and how it needs to sort of follow a certain history. So again, you're being given these different things, and um, if you don't know that it's your job to organize that chaos, then you're going to burn a lot of your time just sort of not knowing what to do and stabbing in the dark, just coming up with things that look good versus
Mm.
just really understanding what the business problem is that you're being asked to address with creativity, and then delivering those options in a way that's on brand, on strategy, and on message. So um, the creative strategy framework is there for people to write down their notes in the kickoff meeting in this framework in a way that begins to organize that information, and also in a way that you can then take the notes from the meeting and then turn them into a whiteboard session whenever you go back to the creative team, and then the findings from that framework, after you go through the three steps, um, you can then turn into a brief, or you can then use as sort of thought starters if you're concepting and creating work. So the framework itself, the four columns start with the target, who we're trying to talk to, and you need to define that target in a fragment that includes demographic information, right? Psychographic information. How does someone think? What do they believe? And then their behavior characteristics, like what do they do? Um,
Yeah.
the demographics is obviously, the facts, right? Are you married? Are you not married? Household income? What is your zip code? How many people are in your household? Those sort of male, female, non-binary, all those things are the demographic information. How much money you make per year. But with those three things, you can start to understand a person. A person starts to emerge from the cold data or the research. That's just really important for you to understand.
And I think this is one of the most important parts of the
Absolutely.
framework, as far as I can say. And many of the times, the brand marketers also doesn't know exactly those questions. I mean, because most of the time when we talk about target customer, a brand marketer or like any business person thinks demographics. Okay, I'm targeting 15-year-olds that are going to high school and girls living in this area. But that's not the case. I mean, it needs to, because you mentioned like psychographic, which I think we should really punctuate on that. So, what's the problem? What are the
Right.
problems that
Right.
they are going
Right.
through? What's the
Right.
tension in their life? Well, I mean, of course, we are not going to cover every tension
Yes.
that they are going
Yes.
through their life, but the tensions that are relevant to the brand itself.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that
Hmm.
you pulled that out. And so oftentimes, someone who's a creative person may be thinking, "Oh my God, like you're asking me for all these things that are completely outside of what I'm comfortable with and what I know how to do." Yes, I understand that. Here's a way to make it easy. Many of us watch Netflix. So maybe you've watched
Yeah.
the Ozark, that series, right? So you got Marty Bird, you got Wendy Bird, you got their kids, right? Let's say if you could find a character from a TV show or Netflix series that could become the persona who symbolizes
Hmm.
your target, it becomes very easy to visualize who you're supposed to be talking to. And at that point, this is really important because the tone of the creative, the language in the writing, um, what the design looks like, all of those things, you if you know who you're talking to, you can have a much better chance of proposing something that they would find interesting enough to engage with. So it's really
Hmm.
important to think about personas so that you can then in the chart write a very simple sentence fragment. You could write, suburban married um, man, high stress, right? If we're talking about Marty Bird, high stress job, um, and we can continue to sort of think about, well, how would we describe in a very quick sentence Marty Bird's living situation and his existence? He's going from problem to problem in a high stress situation. Needs to make decisions really quickly. That tells me what life is like in the morning when they wake up, when they need to actually get the kids ready, or when he's getting ready to go to work, right? So again, this is just a
Yeah.
small little tactic for creative people to visualize who we're talking to in order to make sure that you can write those sentence fragments. It might be single mother, urban single mother with, you know, a corporate job, white collar job. Um, we can then start to think about exactly what the morning might be like. We can understand that this person might have a nanny, so their white collar job gives them more household income in order to have some support who they have to hire, right? But they're still a
Hmm.
mom, right? So you can still sort of think through who you're talking to. So that's the first column in terms of target. Second column
Hmm.
becomes the facts on. Now, this facts
Hmm.
decision becomes: are we doing a brand? a product, or service. You have to make sure that you're thinking about that in the correct way. You need to understand what the scope of the job you're being asked to solve or create is, so that when you think about the facts, it's relative to that scope. So, for instance, if we were working on a brand campaign for Apple, we could write in the facts what their origin story was. Okay, they started in a garage. Steve Jobs, Steve, Wozniak, and they started there, and then they grew the company to the most profitable company in the history of the world, right? We could go through that as the heritage becomes, important because we're doing something on the brand. But if we're doing something on a product, the iPod, or, that's no longer around, but that's a feature now that's been folded into iPhone or into all their products, right? We can do the iPad. So if we're working on a campaign for the iPad or the iPhone, then the fact that they started in the basement or the garage, excuse me, may be less relevant than talking about the features and the benefits of this particular product and how you can get work and fun done all in one place, right? Or if we're working on
Mhm.
a service, if we're talking about Apple Music, right? That's a service. So you need to first decide and understand: Are we working? Are these the facts on the brand, the product, or service, so that you can be really clear what type of information you're going to put in that second column. And I always like to tell people, go beyond what the website says about the company. You need to go beyond what the brand says about itself. You need to go into the reviews. You need to understand what the moment of truth is, which is when those people in the first column, the target, listen to and become customers because they converted into customers from prospects by buying the product. What happens when they get home, open up the product, and start using it? Does it match with what they were sold in the beginning, or are they upset? I can't remember who
Mhm.
said this, but nothing will kill a bad product faster than good advertising. Because when you start to shine the light on these things and then people believe it and buy it, right? If it doesn't live up to what you promised, then a lot more people are now watching and upset about it. So once you understand what the scope is and then you start to dig, go beyond the website. I like to the last thing about this column. I personally, if you're working with a public company or for a public company, I like to tell people to go to the SEC website, the Security and Exchange Commission's website. If you look for the 10K statement, which is in the filings that they have to, file every quarter, there's a section in the 10K statement of every company that's titled risk. And if you read that
Hmm.
section, the company tells you what they're afraid of. They tell you what new entrant into the category they're concerned with. They tell you the effects of climate change on their business as they are projecting it. They tell you how the factory shutting down in China because of COVID has impacted their projections, or whether they are or are not going to hit their numbers. It's really important for people to understand that even if you have a template or framework, or you understand these business concepts, that they're just as good, they're only as good as the information that you as the creative person put into them, right? So
Hmm.
you have to look in places for those facts, right? The
Mhm.
truth in places that other designers won't look, so that you can in some ways come up with the possibility to find insights that some people won't find. But it's important to sort of judge what you write in that column based on, can I build a campaign off of that?
Hmm.
Your third column, mhm.
So it's like the topic was the persona, which we
Yes,
covered, and the second topic is the
yeah,
facts, or okay, is it an iPad, iPhone, or the
brand,
brand, Apple
product, or
brand
service. What
itself?
are we doing? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, what are we doing? And then they say that it's the iPad. Then the facts is not only about the iPad itself, but the facts is what are the things that are going on around the iPad, right?
facts.
That someone currently had a problem with the iPad, and then there's like a word of mouth around that. Those type of things,
Yes,
as far
and
as I could
and
understand.
fact wise, what you're digging for again is how people perceive the product, how it's being used. That's why I'm asking you to go for reviews. But it's also important for you to look at the facts as they pertain to how the company sees what the challenges are, which is why I'm asking also for you to find places that people are not looking for information so you can factor those things in. This is about weaving strategy into the creative process. And so you have to look and you got to uncover, rocks, uncover
Mhm.
insights. You have to think how they think. So how are they thinking? They're thinking about this stuff that that's not even on your radar. And this is where,
Mhm.
as creative people, we can really start to become more relevant. We can be seen as more strategic partners instead of an order taker who is interchangeable. And if you don't like my price, or if my workflow is not right, or if you don't like the quality of the work, I can fire you and hire someone else, plug you back into the process without any issues. That's not true once
Yeah.
we become more strategic. So, in
Mhm.
thinking about the third column, which are the features and
Mhm.
benefits, let's say we've chosen that iPad. Now,
Yeah.
the features are physical. So, one
Mhm.
button, touch screen, what is the storage capacity? What is the chip processing speed inside? What's the resolution of the camera? All that you just itemize that product and you isolate the different features. Again, just like the physical features of a person, your sight, your being able to see, being able to hear. You look at the product or the brand or the service, and you look at what the features are. And the features are what the brand is concerned with. The
Yeah.
benefit is what comes from that feature that the
Mhm. Mhm.
target is concerned with, the person is concerned with. How does this make my life better? So
Mhm.
these things are written in a ratio. So 1 to 1, this feature enables this benefit. And this is the hard part for creatives because it's going to require you to really sit down, really observe, and then therefore just write what you see. So what are the
Mhm.
physical? Let's audit this product, right? And then from there, what does this feature enable? How does this feature benefit this person? Now, features are physical and sort of tangible. The
Mhm.
benefit to someone's life is intangible.
Mhm.
So it's really important to understand that. And you have to frame it within those terms. So this feature slash this benefit. And then you just itemize that as many as you can think about. And it's important to understand that some features will have multiple benefits. And in this first step, which is quantity, you're going to want to just list as many different targets as you can, list as many facts as you can from as many places as you can find them, list and exhaust sort of the features and benefits as quickly as you can, because your job is really about quantity, so you're not really judging it. And as creative people, it's really important to
Mhm.
say that because what do? We do something, we judge it, we throw it away. We start over. Do something, judge it, throw it away. I'm asking you to fight that urge and just think about quantity. Just fill up the chart first, and then we can go back through with step 2, which is quality. Then we start asking ourselves
Yeah.
questions. We start rewriting things. We start, subtracting things or adding things that we missed. So features and benefits, and then the last column is really important based on if you're pitching new business or if you're being asked to sort of do an additional product with an existing account, which is the message or the objective. The message is what
Mm.
do we want the target consumer in the first column to come away with? What do we want them to understand once they come away from interacting with one of our ads or from our event or from our website or after they download our app or after they open up the
Mhm.
iPad, right? So, what is that message? And you just, as Luke Sullivan, the author of "Hey Whipple Squeeze This," always says in his book, you say it straight, then you say it great. So don't think about copywriting here. Just like, what do you want people to understand after they come in contact with what it is that we are creating? And then the objective is exactly what that client or whoever's briefing you may tell you, but it's also
Mhm.
important for you to also understand, again, think how they think. As creative people, what could we recommend? If you think about the creative process, we're probably going to offer 3 different options on this particular brief. So why can't
Mm.
we think about if we understand the business category, if we start to look at consumer behavior, if we pull out some insights that are interesting to us enough for us to then weave those into the option, we could then consider and recommend certain things that the client should be thinking about. But that's only after obviously answering what they asked us for. There are two other options there that you could potentially decide to sort of go into a completely different direction, but in a direction that is within what the problem is that they're trying to solve. There's no way to do that if you don't understand commerce, if you don't understand business, if you can't speak and understand the language. You can't propose things that are also on topic that are also relevant. So those objectives might be increasing sales or decreasing sales or driving traffic or more foot traffic or launching this product. But it's important that if you're pitching, you have to understand there's a reason that that last group of designers or that last agency lost the account and then they're talking to you right now. What is that reason?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if they were not leading the client with recommendations, that's probably a part of why they got fired. They were doing what the client asked them to do, and therefore
Mhm.
they let the client lead in a situation where they were more um, suited to recommend. Think about a brain surgery patient telling the doctor how to do the operation, right? You don't want to do that. So understand this.
And you cannot do it by Google searching,
Exactly. And
right?
so, just as creatives, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important for you to understand how important we are in in this process, but to understand why we're in the room, and then understand also what the people outside the creative team are being sort of tasked with solving or what they're concerned with. If you can understand the full picture, the other perspectives that are involved, you can recommend, and that's really important to understand that that's the transition between uh, becoming strategic or just remaining tactical. That we have to
Yeah.
understand exactly what the larger picture is that are beyond aesthetics, or understand the things that drive aesthetics, or the why behind what things look like, the strategy behind the
Mhm.
execution. So after you go through those four columns, in exhausting those columns with as much quantity as you can, you then clean for quality. You start to question the different elements. Is this the right way to frame this target? Is there an aspect of demographics, psychographics, or behavioral characteristics that are less relevant or that's irrelevant, right? If you think
Yeah.
of certain products,
Just
yeah, right.
declutter the strategy
And you
framework.
start
Yeah.
to eliminate things. Then
Yeah.
again, there are different questions in each column. If you look at chapter 6 and 7 in the book, it really exhaustively sort of looks at these questions. Um, and then, step 3 is to pull out the strategic threads. Now that you've sort of cleaned this for quality and you've refined what you've put in there, you can look across categories and sort of connect the dots on threads. This particular
Mhm.
target group, this fact we can open the conversation on, they'd be interested in these features and benefits that is in any headline or copy in order to achieve this objective or to impart this message. And that's kind of also the way that you're going to defend the work. If you
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
it, you're presenting the work in the context of everything that you've just talked about in order to pull that thread out. Or if you have this brief that's the size of a novel and you've gone through this process, you now have a
Mhm.
strategic thread that you could focus the creative brief on if you're in a job in your organization that would allow you to do that. Or you can ask clarifying questions that fill in the blanks when what you were given falls short, because you know now what it is that you're being asked to do. So you can at least sort of focus and ask the right questions. You can become a lot more confident with the time that you
Mhm.
have, because you're now going back to the table to the person who gave you the assignment and you're asking them for what you need based on the investigation that you did. That's a lot more focused and a bit more laser, focused on only the relevant issues here, um, that you need to basically do your job. So from there, again, this is how I organize the chaos and then question the answers. Again, going back to ask further questions in order to then find those insights, because I'm looking in places that a lot of people aren't looking as creatives. And
Mhm.
then I'm turning those
Mhm.
insights into executions. I'm going into the meeting, I'm actually setting up and communicating what my recommendations are first, and then I'm explaining
Mhm.
why. I also have things that I consider but did not recommend. They want you to know, they want to understand that stuff too, because there will be things that your client will ask you to consider that are not relevant to the question that you're being asked to solve. Because what happened? We had a pandemic, consumer behavior shifted, everything changed, and people are just like clockwork going back to, well, that worked the last time, so I want that. When the whole world has shifted, and if you're not willing to have a conversation about what and how something is new or should be feasible because it warrants innovation or it merits change, then that's a problem, because as designers, we will probably end up hitting that stuff, finding out those things, and it's up to us to know how to go back to the table to articulate that things have shifted and to help shift people's understanding as to why, if we did the same thing, the environment has changed, or consumer behavior has changed, or everything has changed in a way that would make what used to work completely fall flat. So the
Yeah.
tips, the tricks, the frameworks that are in creative strategy are just as good as the information and the analysis that you pull out of them. It's important, and this is the last thing I'll say about this. Everybody has an opinion, but our clients pay us
Mhm.
for our analysis. It's very important for us to lead the
Yeah.
client in our expertise, so that even
Mm.
if we're pushing back on something, or a client comes to you and they say, hey, here's our problem, and after you investigate it, you realize that's not your problem. This other thing is your problem. Let me explain why. You're going to have to go through that process. And if you do go through that process and you challenge what the thinking was, there's one or two outcomes. You may get fired, but hey, what's new, right? We're creative people. When the recession hits, who's first to get fired? It's us. They can always run last year's ads, right? So you're always in a situation where you could get fired. There's always another creative person's coming right after you who just graduated. They're hungrier, they're faster, right? So you could get fired because of that, or your boss gets fired and you're on that team and they're cleaning house. So there's always a reason you could get fired. However, the second thing that could happen is that you challenge the client, the organization, the business in a way that they understand the value that you bring to the table, and they value your insights and your ability to then bring those things to the table in a way that can be understood and leveraged on behalf of the brand or on behalf of the consumer. And that's a completely different situation. It's a different position to be in. At that point, you're being seen
Mhm.
for the value that you bring, and you can command the prices that reflect that value, and you can
Yeah.
become a strategic partner as a creative person. I believe it's our job to influence brands to be responsible from within as creative people, using what it is that we
Mhm.
do in order to then go into the room and move things in the way that would be best, not just for the brand, but also for the consumer. That's our job as creative
Mhm.
people. We have to think how they think to do what we do. And this is just one way, within creative strategy and the business of design, that I've found value in, whether it's to write a brief, to focus a brief, to question what you were given, or to run a strategy session, or it helps you to organize that chaos so you can question those answers, so you can find those insights and turn them into executions.
Wow. It's so fascinating because I mean, as a strategist, I'm not a creative person, but I work with a lot of creatives. But as a strategist, I mean, the framework that I follow already is who is the customer, what's the fact, what's the product, the features, the highlight features, and what's the problem that we are trying to solve. And then you are giving that perspective from the creative's mind. That's why you call it creative
That's right.
strategist, because then I mean, like, as a brand, for example, if a creative person comes up to me with these questions like, okay, who am I talking to? Is it Marty Bird? What's he gonna like? Okay, what are the things that we are trying to solve in his life? What are the features that are relevant? I mean, if a creative asks these questions to me, then even if I'm a person who doesn't even understand what design is, and if I think that the design is also something that you can do with Canva Pro, let's say,
Mhm.
uh, then I would say that okay, there's like an additional benefit of working
That's
with
right.
this creative
That's right.
person, because that person is asking me these
There you go.
questions, which then creativity and design is not something to just use Adobe and then come up with nicely
That's
looking
right.
templates, right? It's more than
And
that.
the best part about this is how I train my students. That
Yeah.
if I can teach the creative people to approach their creative roles as a strategist, then now
Yeah.
what you're doing is you're guarding against someone replacing you because you're just hands. You're head and hands. And now I'm actually looking at you in a way that maybe you can build a team. And
Yeah.
here's a little warning. The other creatives, once you start doing this, and the other people who are in the other parts of the business who are not used to this from creative people, there's going to be a little fear there. They're going to be a little insecure about like, whoa, what's happening, right? I'm not used to this perspective from this person. So if you have other creative people who are just taught to focus on those tactical parts of what those strategic decisions are, and they don't know what and how you're approaching these problems, right? And how you're showing up, how you're doing it, then there will be some insecurity there as well. And so I want to prepare creatives who decide to become more strategic to understand that this journey of becoming more strategic, it upends the way that the expectations are. And some people are going to like that. They're going to see the value in having you. Other people are going to be afraid of it. And therefore, as creative people, we're emotional, right? That's why and how we can sort of translate the rational language of business into the emotional language of design. Like that's our superpower. But many people don't become versed in how to control their emotions as creative people to go into that boardroom or to start to assert themselves strategically after learning this stuff, because their emotions are just so loud that it becomes really hard to deal with the fact that once you change your perspective, you have a target on your back, or you're the target as the person who to actually talk to in terms of this new perspective. So just know that there's an aspect of this that has to do with also controlling your emotions, because you understand
Hmm.
that when you walk into that room and emotions are high and you poured your whole life into your latest baby, your creation, right? It's hard not to hear those criticisms as I don't like your nose, right? But it's not personal. And I think we have to understand that. And that's a part of becoming more strategic. And the transition from being tactical is understanding that this is larger than what this looks like. It's larger than
Yeah.
what you like or what you dislike, which should not be a part of the process. This works because of this and that, or it doesn't work because of this. And all those things need to go back to that strategy. They need to go back to that target. They need to go back to that heritage. They need to go back to those
Hmm.
features and benefits. They need to go back to the objectives that you're trying to reach or the message that you're trying to impart. And you need to be able to justify them in the context of all those things so that you can
Hmm.
defend without being defensive. But just understand that this is a new way to think about this, even though it's not really new. A lot of buzzwords that people talk
Hmm.
about, you won't find design thinking in the book at all, because I was familiar with it, but I understood that really what we're doing is what is not necessarily new. It's just new to our audience. It's just new to our
Hmm.
audience. All we're talking about is marketing strategy, business objectives. All we're talking about is taking something that's always existed and sort of revealing it to the creative people who didn't know, but also in doing that, we expose the business people to what we do as creatives, how the creative
Yeah.
drives the business, how, what
Yeah.
we're doing, what our product is, interfaces and interacts with the people who they're trying to build relationships with. We can't do this without each other. And so it's just really important to bridge that communication gap.
Perfect. Perfect. I mean, as a closing point, since this will be the last episode of the year, just a few days before we end the year, um, is there any thoughts that you can share in the new year that design can and creative will evolve? I mean, I know that this is a big question, and at the end of the day, a year is a short period of time, just as I said on my previous podcast. But I mean, where do you see design evolving and creative evolving in this time where attention is really getting lower and lower in terms of minutes?
I'm going to try to weave together a few things that we talked about in order to help people in this answer.
Yeah.
I think,
Hmm.
you know, there is no one right answer. There's just your right answer and why you think it's right. So
Hmm.
I don't know where things are going, but here's what I do know. I do know this. Um, I mentioned at the very beginning that my high school guidance counselor never had one conversation with me about college. So
Hmm.
when I was in the 11th grade in the summer, I decided to take my SAT 3 times to get the best score that I could. I decided to go to summer school, take an additional math, take my foreign language requirements because I realized that if I don't go to college, I want it to be because I decided not to go to college versus the fact that I couldn't go because I didn't even have the requirements. So by the time I graduated, again, never had a conversation about college with this guy's guidance counselor who gets paid to actually help people transition from high school into some sort of post secondary education. But I realized that when I graduated, I still had not applied to a college. So I stumbled onto a conversation. I'm always stumbling on the conversations, but I stumbled onto this conversation about Hampton University, which is a historically black university in Virginia.
Hmm.
And turns out that I was volunteering with an organization where the gentleman who I was working with had gone to Hampton University and was an alumni. So I stumbled onto a recruiting conversation that was in the next room. And I remember him saying, if you have the college requirements, you should apply. And I had the college requirements. So, what am I saying to you in this new year? It's obvious that when I started web design, and actually when I started my career in 1999, you couldn't study web design because it didn't exist, right?
Hmm.
No one in the dot com era had a web design experience because it did not exist. We were all there because we understood that our willingness to learn something new, this new language, this new thing, um, that's why we were there. But everybody had something different on their degree. None of us had web design. You could not study that. So there's a lot of fear and imposter syndrome among creative people. And I would just tell you that if in 1999 none of us wasted our time thinking, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing, right? Then you shouldn't either. And it's important to focus on the options and not the plans because you can plan stuff, but it's really important to plan to increase your options like I did in high school. I did not know
Hmm.
what I was doing or if I would even go to college, but I knew that I wanted to have the option to go. So
Hmm.
I plan to have the option to go. Increase your options is what I'm saying because just like Flash, something else is going to die, right? We've always had to learn additional skills in order to remain relevant in our job as creative people. We've always had to
Hmm.
learn new stuff, whether it's coding, the next, version of Photoshop, these new workforce or sorry, project management software or Squarespace or whatever it is, there's always going to be something new that we're going to have to learn in order to become relevant. I'm arguing that learning business skills for a creative person, learning strategy for a creative person is how you increase your options. So you should be ready for the transitions that happen in everyone's creative arc, in everyone's career arc,
Yeah.
going from freshman in college to first day on the job, going from first day on the job to mid level with a couple reports, going from mid level with a couple reports to senior client facing role, going from account director to creative director, going from creative director to principal of your own thing. You will have a journey. It's going to be different from other people's journey, but none of it you're going to be able to predict, right? You might be in the ballpark, but you can't predict everything, right? But what you can do is be prepared for the options. You can invest in yourself. You can focus on you. You can make sure
Yeah.
you develop yourself in a way that you can gain confidence in yourself. I'll end with saying that success for me is keeping your word to yourself. And if you can learn to gain confidence in your own word that you keep to yourself, then there is no change or recession or being fired or challenge that's going to put you in a situation where you can't figure it out because you've developed a rapport with your word to yourself. And as long as you
Yeah.
can keep your word to yourself, whatever that means, working on gaining new skills, right? Acknowledging that you're afraid of public speaking, knowing that it's hard for you to learn new concepts in business or that it's difficult to do so, but acknowledging that and then deciding to make a step towards making that weakness a strength, you'll be fine. Doesn't matter what happens.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying in the new year to everybody, 2023. Be ready for the transitions by investing in yourself, by keeping your word to yourself, and you'll be a success no matter what happens.
Yeah. Wow. That's very powerful. I mean, it also helped me reflect on while you were talking, reflect on the things that I'm doing as well. Thanks a lot
Thank you for having me.
for this conversation, and I really hope that people would just get the book and learn these frameworks more, because there's too much to talk around it. And I would really not suggest, because I'm also a business person, a marketer. I'm not a creative person, but take the book because I thought that it's important to understand the creative side of the business. That's why I highly suggest the book, not only to creative people but also to the business people, so that they can understand how the creative flow works. Thanks a lot for that.
Thank you for having me.